Hello and welcome again to Conscious TV. I'm Iain McNay and today my guest is Brad Warner. Hi Brad.
Hello.
And I came across a copy of Brad's first book. Full title is Hardcore Zen, Punk Rock, Monster Movies and the Truth About Reality, which I thought, well, that sounds like an interesting read. So I had a read of that and I moved on to Zen Wrapped in Karma, Dipped in Chocolate, A Trip Through Death, Sex, Divorce, and Spiritual Celebrity in Search of the Truth Dharma, which is another interesting one. And then Sit Up and Shut Down, Punk Rock Comedies on Buddha, God, Truth, Sex, and Death. So there's a feel of what we might be talking about in the interview today. So Brad, let's start kind of near the beginning of life. I know you were telling me earlier that there was something that happened fairly early on which kind of symbolized a change in life, and I think you were at an Ohio club one evening in the States at a gig.
Yeah. There were a lot of gigs, but there was just a kind of a general feeling that was arising when I was doing this. I was playing bass in a punk rock band, a hardcore band called Zero Defects, and we would do these shows in these lousy bars, you know, and I had this feeling that I wanted my life to be on some sort of a trajectory towards some kind of truth. And the reason I had gotten into the punk rock scene was because I thought that might be a means to find that. I thought this was a group of people who were trying to do something, trying to affect some change in the world and in themselves. But you know, there were just being in that scene and seeing the kind of foolishness and insanity of it all, I felt like, well, there has to be something a little bit deeper than this. And it was around that time that I first got introduced to Zen.
Because that band you were in, Zero Defects, it was really quite hardcore music. I was listening to a clip on YouTube the other day, and it's not easy listening, is it?
No, for sure. I was not the first bass player in Zero Defects. They had two different guys before me, and I used to go see the band. And I remember the first time I saw Zero Defects, I thought they were just making it up. I thought they were just going on stage and banging anything out and screaming. You know, I thought it was sort of this experimental thing. And when I joined the band, I found out there were actually songs. I was kind of surprised, you know.
Yeah. So how was life at school? I know you said in the first book, Hardcore Zen, that you weren't very cool at school.
Well, not in high school for sure, because I have a kind of a convoluted history in that I was born in a small town in Ohio, you know, in the rural sort of Midwest of the United States, and lived my early years in this sort of suburb of Akron, which in Akron is just kind of a very industrial sort of blue-collar type of working class town. And then when I was 7 years old, my father got transferred to Nairobi, Kenya for his work at the Firestone Tire Company. So we spent 3.5 years, almost 4 years there, and then we moved back to the same town. So my worldview had been altered completely. So I couldn't, I don't know how well I fit in with the rest of Ohio society before that, but I certainly couldn't after that because I'd seen too much. So that sort of alienation kind of fed into getting into punk rock and then later on getting into Zen, a lot of it.
You saw the band Diva on TV,
yeah.
You were saying, and that changed something for you.
Yeah, that was a big moment because they were on a program called Saturday Night Live, which is a comedy program, you know, late at night. And I saw them because I had been I was about 13 or 14 years old. I'd picked up the guitar. I was starting to learn songs. I was getting into rock music. But my feeling was that rock music was kind of a dead issue. Everything I listened to and enjoyed was from the 60s. You know, The Who were my big #1 favorite band at the time, and I was aware of the then contemporary Who music, and it didn't interest me that much. You know, I was into My Generation and all this, you know, that kind of stuff. So it seemed like rock music had kind of finished. And then seeing Devo on television was just a revelation, because I'd heard about the band and seen their pictures, but I'd never heard them. And I thought, well, these are people, and they're doing this very powerful rock music, and they are not much older than me, and they're not only that, from the same city, you know, they're from Akron. So it just made me feel like, okay, well, something's opened up here, you know, now something is about to happen in the world, and maybe I can be part of that in some way.
Because you also say in the book that you felt like the early punk rock scene had a lot in common with Zen. What do you actually mean by that?
Yeah, well, I think the punk rock scene that I was exposed to in Ohio was a lot different from what happened over here in the UK. At least the early part of the sort of UK scene with the Sex Pistols and well, maybe not so much the Clash, but anyway, this was a very a lot of our influences were coming out of Washington, D.C., and they were very politically motivated, and they had this kind of a strange, looking back on it, strange moral sense. And I don't mean strange in a negative way. It was just a very unusual sense of having a very strong commitment to moral action, but at the same time having a very deep commitment to rejecting society's idea of what was moral action. So it was motivated by this kind of sort of anti-nuclear thing was a very big deal. That was a sort of issue everybody rallied around. The band I was in had a song called "Drop the A-Bomb on Me." That's our sort of hit. And once I started seeing what Zen was, I felt like Zen had the same sort of a commitment, a deep commitment to moral action, and a deep commitment to finding your own way. You know, part of what punk rock was about was rejecting authority, and it was rejecting authority not just in a knee-jerk way because it was authority, but saying that these people in authority are obviously just as confused as anybody else, so we can't trust them. So we have to find our own sort of inner authoritative sense, which is also a big part of Zen. Is there isn't a God in the usual sense. I'm writing a book now about why I think there is God in Zen, but there's not the authoritative God who speaks through some sort of a mediator who tells you what's right and what's wrong. You have to discern that for yourself, and that's a big, crucial part of the practice.
Mm. So you actually discovered or came across Zen when you were at university, didn't you? Kent State University, and you went to a lecture, and there was a guy, I think you were 19, and there was a guy called Tim who was a Zen teacher, and you instantly connected with something he said. I've written down here somewhere. Well, it doesn't really matter, you tell me how it was for you.
Well, I signed up for a course called Zen Buddhism, which was actually not even for credit, because that was Kent State University being a very conservative university. I think the idea of a course in Zen Buddhism was a bit freaky for them. So I get there, and Tim McCarthy is the teacher, and he was and is still about 10 years older than me, so there isn't a huge age gap there. And he read a piece called the Heart Sutra, and in the Heart Sutra there's this line right in the sort of middle of the sutra that says, "Form is emptiness, emptiness is form." And I still get a little chill when I say that, because when I first heard that, I thought, that's right. I don't know what that means, but it seems to be deeply true, and I want to find out what that means.
So emptiness is form, and form is emptiness.
Yes. Yeah.
And somehow instinctively, you thought that was true at that time.
Yeah, it was like I'd heard it before, although there's no possibility I could have heard it before, but it was like something that was like written in my cells, you know.
Yeah.
And I wanted to know what it meant. Yeah, and it's a controversial little line, though. Everybody has their own interpretation of it.
And I think you liked Tim because you felt he really was himself. He wasn't perfect,
Yeah.
but he was authentic, and that obviously appealed to you as playing in a punk band and all the rest of it.
Yeah, Tim was incredibly and remains incredibly authentic. He's a very straight person, and I could tell that he wasn't lying to me. You know, I'd always, at the time I was looking into religion, and I always felt there was a kind of pretense there whenever I'd go to a church or something. I've since discovered that there is a kind of deeper Christianity than the one I was exposed to. But the one I was exposed to was all about you know, memorizing certain formulas and bringing others into the fold. And there seemed to be this kind of desperation, you know, that I can't believe what I'm telling you unless you believe it too, so you have to believe it. You know, the people who were sort of preaching this gospel seemed to need me to believe it. Whereas Tim didn't project anything like that. You know, he was just telling me and the rest of the class something that he felt was deeply true, and he was very stable within that, and that was a powerful thing.
And that first Zen session, you had to sit and
Yeah.
look at the wall for 20 minutes.
That's right. Yeah.
How was that first 20 minutes?
Oh, it was horrible. It was terrible. Yeah, he taught us this type of meditation called Zazen, in which, as you say, you just sit on a cushion and stare at a wall for 20 minutes. And I'd read a couple of very small pieces about, I wasn't an avid reader of meditation books, but I'd read here and there. So I kept expecting something to happen. You know, I thought, well, this position, there must be something magical here, and I'm going to hold this position, and I'm going to meditate now, and something's going to happen. And I remember thinking, well, nothing is happening, you know, and thinking, a minute has passed, you know, and I have to sit here for 19 more minutes still. You know, it was brutal, I thought, you know. But at the same time, I could see that there was something there, and I continued the practice really from that day forward.
So
with gaps.
When you said you could see there was something there, can you talk about that more? Because a lot of people would give up.
Yeah.
Here they're told to sit and look at the wall and nothing happens. They think on to the next thing. But so what was it? What was the root of this determination to keep going?
You know, it's a good question, and it's one that I find difficult to answer even for myself, because I don't really know. I could feel a kind of intuitive sense that this practice was valuable, and I had a kind of a deep trust in Tim McCarthy as a person, that he had done this practice. He'd started it when he was about 11 years old or something amazing like that. Under kind of similar circumstances to me, he'd just at random run into a Zen teacher in his childhood who taught him this practice and said, this is good for you. And I could feel that there was something profound there, even though I also felt like I must be missing it. But maybe if I sit still and quietly for long enough, I might stop missing it. You know, but it's hard to say where that determination happened. I could feel that it was real and that it was honest. And that was very important to me.
I understand that, yeah.
And it didn't make any claims for itself. It said, well, Tim would say, you know, you could have this experience called enlightenment. You might not have this experience called enlightenment. Or you might have the experience of enlightenment and not notice that you've had the experience of enlightenment. There were all sort of possibilities. But there was never sort of a promise that you're going to have this thing. And for some reason, that had the opposite effect that it has on a lot of people, on me, which was that it made me want to do it more. You know?
And then shortly after that, your music direction changed, and you started a band called Dementia 13, which really wasn't a band, it was just you.
Yeah.
And you got 5 albums out over a period of time.
Yeah, I did. Yeah, Dementia 13 was just this, I got into, because as I mentioned earlier, I was into the 60s stuff, and I got very deeply into the psychedelia, you know, Syd Barrett especially. you know, I got a hold, somebody given me the first two Syd Barrett, well, I guess he only ever did two, the two Syd Barrett albums. I would just listen to those obsessively, and I started to produce this sort of strange psychedelic music. And I made these tapes, you know, where I'd build up layers myself of the instruments, sent them off to a record label called Midnight Records in New York City. And this French guy named J.D. Martignon was the head of the record label, and he liked these weird tapes that I was sending him and wanted to put out an album, and eventually it turned into 5 albums. By the end, I'd actually put together a real band, but 3 of those 5 albums are just me doing all the instruments.
Did you feel your practice, your Zen practice, was influencing the music?
Definitely. It's funny to me now because we just did this project with a record label called Smogvale, where we digitized all the Dementia 13 albums, and they're available for download now. So I listened to them all again. And I can hear, even in the early ones, these sort of coded references to Zen that that no one else could possibly pick up on. I was a bit embarrassed. You know, I didn't want to be like, I'm a great fan of George Harrison, but I didn't want to be George Harrison, you know, saying, you know, go and chant Hare Krishna or whatever. I didn't want to be trying to push my religion on the audience. So I would put it in very subtle ways. So a lot of the things, because it was psychedelic music, a lot of the things people took from that music as being drug influenced weren't. You know, I'd had a brief flirtation with LSD that I found horrible. You know, I didn't like it at all. So gave that up rather quickly and moved on to meditation. So there are a lot of references to meditative states and things that show up in the music that people, just given the packaging and the way the albums were presented, just thought, oh, he's talking about, you know, magic mushrooms. But I wasn't, you know, I was talking about meditation.
And you moved into a house which was full of Zen practitioners.
Yeah.
Also must have strengthened your practice and your commitment, I guess.
Yeah, Tim had a house he called the Kent Zendo, and it was a revolving group of people, but we had a practice space in the first floor, or the ground floor, you know, to talk in proper British English, where we'd have every weekend these Zazen things, and so there was a kind of a commitment. You had to be committed to the practice if you're going to live there. A couple of people weren't so committed, but anyway, I took it on as a kind of a personal responsibility to be serious about it at that point, and that led to a kind of a deepening of it. And actually, an English magazine called Bucket Full of Brains sent somebody out to interview me when I was living in that house. And that was one of the first times I remember doing that interview where because he'd been in the house and seen what it was, I said, yeah, well, a lot of what I'm doing is influenced by my Zen practice. And that was the first time I'd kind of gone public. I mean, I didn't have a huge public, you know, there was very indie underground music, but it was the first time I'd sort of admitted it and said, yeah, this is what I'm, you know, this is what's important to me. You know.
And then shortly after that, you moved to Japan.
Yeah.
To teach English, and that started a whole, it's ironical that was the home of Zen you moved to,
yeah.
but that's a whole new adventure started there.
Yeah, because I moved to Japan for a job. I didn't have a decent job. I had a university degree by then, but Ohio was and still is a very economically depressed area. Couldn't find a job, and I'd always been interested in Japan and Japanese culture. I found you could go teach English there, so I did that, and ended up sort of ironically leaving behind my Zen teacher, you know, to go to Japan. And when I got to Japan, what I discovered was it was quite difficult, and still is, to find a teacher who will teach you Zen practice in Japan. There are Zen temples everywhere. You know, every corner has a Zen temple. They're like churches or something. But very few of them actually engage in Zazen practice. They are sort of community places that function within the community. They do funerals, they do a couple other ceremonies and things. Coming of age ceremonies are often held at the Zen temples. Um, but they don't do a meditation practice. So I was in Japan for a year before I actually came across the teacher who ended up ordaining me. And that was under a whole other set of weird circumstances.
But before that, you got involved with making Japanese monster movies, which was your dream job.
Yeah, I was a big fan of the Godzilla films when I was a kid, and particularly this television program that they played in the States. I don't think it ever played over here. It was called Ultraman, which was sort of a 30-minute Godzilla film every week. Ultraman was this giant superhero who would fight these giant monsters. And when I was in Japan, I started reading a book by the man who was the president of the company that made Ultraman, and he was also the son of the guy who had done the special effects on Godzilla. So he had a very strong connection there. And this book I was reading partly out of interest and partly out of trying to get better at Japanese. He wrote a lot about how he wanted to expand internationally and sell his programs and make Ultraman as big internationally as it was in Japan, because it's huge in Japan. So I wrote him a letter, and it turned out that he was looking for somebody. He was looking for hopefully an American, but some sort of a foreign person to come and work at his company and try to do marketing for them. So it was a case of being extremely lucky, and getting this job. I thought, well, I had this initial very naive feeling, which is embarrassing because I was almost 30 years old at the time, to have this sort of childish feeling that, well, my troubles are all over now because I've got my dream job. I've got this job where I can work on something that I really love, so it'll never be a drag anymore to go to work. And that lasted for about a month, So,
Yeah.
yeah.
But you found a Zen group when you were out there eventually.
Yeah, because working for that company brought me to Tokyo. Tokyo is the big capital city in Japan. And I started looking around to see if there were any Zen teachers there, because I'd been in a rural city before teaching English. And I just came across an advert in a local free paper marketed towards foreigners, written in English, which said Zazen practice with lectures on Shobo Genzo, which is an ancient book about Zen, every Saturday at 1 in the afternoon. So I went along to see what these lectures were, and I met this guy named Gudo Nishijima. And Nishijima Roshi he was an elderly Japanese man with a shaved head who wore robes, and he had the image, unlike Tim McCarthy, he had the image of a Zen master. But he was also a very highly opinionated person, very much himself, very sort of iconoclastic, didn't get along with the Zen institutions that exist in Japan, although he had been ordained through this institution called Soto School, whatever, which is the largest sort of Zen. They're like the sort of Roman Catholic Church, or the Church of England of Zen Buddhism. And he didn't get along with them, kind of rejected what they did, and so he was a bit of a punk himself, although his age, he was quite older than any punk I'd ever met, but he had that attitude, and I just felt some kind of attraction. Initially, I didn't like him, actually, but
I think you were saying the first lecture you went to in your book, you were saying you didn't go back for quite some time.
Yeah.
You found him too arrogant, didn't really connect with him.
Yeah, I found him extremely arrogant. He almost kind of reminded me of a fire and brimstone preacher, but he had the same quality that Tim had, which is he would say these things in a very forthright way, allowing for no sort of reinterpretation of what he wanted to say. But he didn't care if you believed it. He wasn't desperate to change anybody's mind. He just stood there, kind of like a rock. I felt like a big immovable rock. And people would try to move this rock that was Nishijima Roshi, but they couldn't. And that was very powerful because he was extremely centered and very, very balanced, and I could see there was something there, and I just kind of continued. Even through hating him, I still continued. I just thought, this guy, I don't like him, but he's saying something that's important, so I better listen to what it is.
And you started at one time to go to weekend retreats.
Yeah.
And there you had to start at 4:30 in the morning. Pretty early start by any standards.
Yeah, and it was terrible. It was brutal. You know, they wake you up at 4:30 in the morning with this horrible clanging bell, and then you immediately, you know, you have just enough time to brush your teeth and splash some water and get dressed, you know, and then you're meditating for the rest of the day, which I'd done a lot of practice with Tim before, but it was always just, we'd do once. I think we'd done some day-long meditations, you know, where you start at about 10 in the morning and end around 4 in the afternoon. I'd done that. But I'd never done anything like this, and this was extremely intensive. So you dig through a lot of stuff, you know, a lot of mental and even physical stuff when you're forced to just sit still for a very, very long period of time in extreme quiet. You know, you feel, I don't know, if you think about it, like one of the things people will remark on is if you walk into a room where people are doing Zen meditation, the feeling you often get is, look at these peaceful people doing this wonderful meditation in the quiet. But the internal feeling is almost never like that. The internal feeling is sometimes like a battle, like a raging battle within yourself. And there were times during those retreats when it was all I could do just to sit still. You know, you come into the retreat very idealistic and thinking, I'm going to have an enlightenment experience, I'm going to realize the truth of the universe, or whatever you think you're going to do, I'm going to achieve peace within myself. And then after, you know, the 6th hour of the first day, it's all you can do just to keep from running out of the room screaming.
So when you say raging battle, give me
Yeah.
some examples.
Well, there's one thing I talk about in the book, which was an experience of extreme fear. So I was doing this practice, and just things, when you're trying to be very quiet, all of the psychological things you've repressed for years and years start to bubble up to the surface. And during one particular retreat, this manifested as something like a panic attack. I was just, it's hard even to remember it now, but I know that I was just absolutely terrified as a person could possibly be, shaking and sweating and doing all of this stuff. But at the same time, I could be rational about it and say, I'm in a room with a bunch of people who are meditating. There's nothing that can possibly harm me here. There's no reason to feel this fear. So I'm just going to sit with it. Because it's either that or get up and run out of the room. But where am I going to run to, you know? The woods? There's nothing.
But
so
is it not quite hard to stay with this rational voice?
Oh, it's terribly hard, you know. And that's where the practice comes in, because the practice is a very physical thing. There's a set form to it. I mean, there's a physical form where you're actually sitting in a very, you know, I keep doing this in a very specific way and just holding this posture. And my teacher, Nishijima Roshi, would say was, you can rely on the posture. You know, when everything else kind of fails you, rely on the posture. And I took that advice and I said, okay, even though I'm terrified, I'm just going to sit still. You know, I'd been doing the practice on a daily basis for more than 10 years by the time this had happened. So I was kind of used to it, but I'd never had an experience quite that difficult to deal with. But I'd had a lot of other experiences that were difficult, you know, where it's just a struggle.
So if you stay with it, then it goes, does it?
Yeah, if you stay with anything long enough and remain quiet and don't feed into it. I mean, this is kind of the trick with Zen practice, is you'll have a feeling or an emotion or something comes up, and what you habitually do is you say, well, that's my emotion, I'm going to find out what that emotion is. I'm going to feel it. I'm going to think about why I'm feeling it. And you know, you have all sorts of habitual things that we all do. Most of them in the realm of holding on to the feeling. And what Zen teachers will tell you is you don't need to hold on to those feelings. They will do whatever they need to do and pass away of their own accord. And ultimately, it's more comfortable to allow that to happen.
So what you're really saying to yourself is that those feelings are not really me. I'm staying where I am, and the feelings will dissolve or move on or whatever, or resolve themselves in time. Is that right? Am I?
Yeah, something like that. I mean, when you when you bring up the issue of what's really me, I mean, this gets into a very complicated and you know, 1,000 books of Zen philosophy have been written on this subject. So, in one sense, all those feelings and things are what you habitually, what you've learned from society and from everyone telling you, either overtly or in subtle ways. You've learned that that is me, and you try to protect that as me. But if you do the practice, you start to realize that if you let go of those things, something fundamental still remains. Something more true than those feelings and those fleeting moments and those personality quirks and all of those issues. There's something there much deeper than that, which sort of witnesses it all pass. And if you can stay with that part of yourself, there's a kind of a depth there and a strength that most of us don't even realize we have.
I know on one of these retreats, you had something fairly dramatic happen, didn't you? You were walking in the countryside and
oh, right, yeah,
you were looking puzzled for a moment.
Yeah, that. Actually, that happened after one of the retreats. I'd done a weekend. It's a funny thing, and I talked about it in Hardcore Zen, and I'm writing a new book where I'm realizing I have to talk about it again, because I think when I talked about it in Hardcore Zen, maybe I gave a lot of people the wrong impression. But I'd done a retreat, and I think it was my first day back to work, although I don't remember really clearly what had happened. But I was on my way to work, I know that, and there was a little footbridge. This is in Japan, in Tokyo, and it was in a kind of outskirts of the city. So there are these little picturesque Japanese kind of footbridges that you cross over. Most of them have been paved over these days and don't look quite as beautiful as they used to. But I was crossing one of those bridges, and just at that moment, everything kind of came together, or maybe fell apart is another way of saying it. But there was a sense of finally coming to terms with all of what this practice had been about up until that time. And certain little phrases I'd heard from my teachers that had not made sense before very suddenly made sense. And I remember Tim saying something, you know, just in passing during, I don't know, probably a conversation we'd had. He said something like, "It's more you than you could possibly be." And I didn't know what he was talking about at the time. You know, what is this thing that's more you than you could possibly be? And at that moment of crossing the bridge, I suddenly thought, yeah, it's more you than you could possibly be. And now, you know, I don't know how many years after that experience, it's hard for me to say it any more clearly than what Tim said. You know, it's more you than you could ever possibly be. There's something in the universe that is more truly and fundamentally me than any sort of imagined idea of what I am could possibly connect with. And it was a moment of understanding that, and that really, it was a big moment for me, but at the same time, you know, it's hard to say how long it lasted. It seemed to last forever and also be over within a couple of minutes, because I crossed over the bridge and continued on, and I got to work. you know, and I wasn't dazed or anything. I was just, okay, well, I'm ready to start my day of work for Subaraya Productions, you know, the Ultraman company today. But something had changed. And it's kind of odd for me that I don't know even what year this happened, because it seemed to knock my sense of time for a loop, and it's never quite come back all the way. Although, you know, you can function. I knew when to be here.
You just to give you a quote that I took out the book.
Yeah.
Everything, you had these problems, they all untwisted themselves and went plop on the ground.
Yeah.
The universe was me and I was it. There was no doubt that that state was true.
Yeah, and it's a funny thing, because if you read somebody say something like that, if I read something like that, my natural tendency is to be skeptical and say, well, that guy must have hallucinated, or he must have had some kind of a psychotic break. You know, there's all sorts of things that could make a person feel that way. But at the same time, having had the internal experience, I know that it was a moment of full-on reality, like I'd never experienced before. But at the same time, it was the basis of everything I had experienced before. So there was a kind of what was funny about it was there was a recognition that nothing had changed. Nothing at all had changed. I'd just kind of forgotten something. There was also a sense of, it's hard to explain this too, but there was a sense of like remembering something that went back to as deep as you could possibly go in your memory. Like this had been my first experience of the world, was like this. And it had been covered over with layers of something during the intervening, 30 years or whatever it had been. And now it was available again. And but I can't make too much out of it, because the saying in the States is, that and a nickel will get you a cup of coffee, but it costs more than a nickel to get coffee now, at Starbucks. That and $2.87 will get you a cup of coffee. Really, it's not, what are you going to do with this, experience?
Well, I'm going to read further, because what I thought was interesting was the depth of the realization you must have had at the time.
Yeah.
And you said, sometimes it's excruciating, those morons that rammed those planes into the World Trade Center, that was me as well. The people who died in the collapse, that was me again.
Yeah, it's funny, because the September 11th terrorist attacks were the big news at the time that I was trying to write this. So that was the image that I kind of latched onto. But there was a feeling like before that had happened, I could have said, oh, those terrorists who did those terrible things. After it happened, there was a sense that there were no terrorists out there doing terrible things, and this all sounds kind of surreal and psychedelic, to say, but there's only us. There is a kind of general sense in which, very deeply and more fundamentally than we're usually aware, there is only one unit operating within the universe. And it takes on a lot of different forms, such that it's very hard for one of its forms to sometimes recognize another one of its forms. But a sense that I had, because I know that September 11th attacks happened after this moment, because I remember watching it thinking, oh my God, what have I done? Which is a strange thing,
So you were watching it and you really thought, oh my God, what have I done? That's extraordinary.
Yeah, well, it was a feeling like there was a sense of there was no one else out there to do this thing. I can see that there is a strong separation between myself and the people who did that attack, because I'm not into terrorism myself, and I have no desire to do anything like that. But I can also see in myself the same sort of stew of things, exactly the same sort of stew of things, not just something kind of like what they went through, but exactly precisely the same sort of things that motivated them in their life and their mistaken understanding of what to do about it, had motivated me as well, and there was no sense that they were other anymore, and everyone who'd there was some frightening aspects of that. There was this kind of feeling of, watching those things on television of people going, hooray, like you want to think of it as terror and horror, which is what it was. But at the same sense, there was this sort of frightening aspect of look at the big spectacle, look at the big explosions, let's look at that explosion again, which I think is quite unhealthy, but it's a tendency people have, to want these things, to want some kind of a terrible thing to happen, and we have to, I feel, make our way towards not wanting those kind of things to happen. I mean, I don't know, I'm going out on a limb even saying this, probably I'll be arrested or something, who knows.
Just to keep the story briefly in sequence, you were then ordained as a Zen Buddhist monk?
Not immediately after, but subsequent to that, I had a teacher, Nishijima Roshi, who I was at a lecture of his one day, and he kind of collared me, not really literally, but he kind of stepped in front of me, and he's maybe 1.5 feet shorter than I am, so this very tiny man, and said, I want to speak to you. And I'd spoken to him a lot by then. We'd kind of developed sort of a friendship. But I'd always initiated everything, because he was the teacher, And he stopped me on the way out and said he wanted to speak to me, and it seemed like it was something very important to him. And he said, I want to make you my Dharma heir, which is in Buddhist practice or Buddhist community, that's a big deal. That is supposedly, I don't put too much stock in it, but that's supposedly the recognition that the student has now achieved the same level of realization as the teacher, and the teacher is supposed to have achieved the same realization as Buddha himself, So it's like conferring upon you Buddhahood, which when he said this to me, I thought, no, you're insane, you're completely out of your mind if you want me to be your Dharma heir. And it took me almost a year of soul searching and trying to figure out what to do before I went back to him and said, I kept going to his lectures, and this was sort of this weird unspoken thing that went on for about a year. And finally I said to him, okay, you want to make me your Dharma heir, let's do the ceremony. But it took a long time to finally decide to be ready for that. I still don't know if I'm ready for it. I proceed as if I am. I have some robes at home, that I can put on. Shaved my head once, grew it all back.
So now you travel around and you have gigs, as you call it, before we started recording, which are talks. People ask you questions. How is that?
Well, it's fun. It's an interesting thing. I'm in the middle of my second sort of European tour. And I do use the word gigs because I don't know what else to call them. If I made it something bigger than that, it's too frightening. So I feel like, okay, I just come up and I talk. But I travel around. I was in the Netherlands and Germany just over the past few weeks, going around giving a lot of talks here and there, running a few retreats and things. And after this, I'll be on my way to Belgium and do it again, and then back to the UK to Manchester to do some more. And so I've kind of become used to this. The year prior to that, I was going around the US and Canada doing the same thing. And it's interesting because I feel like there's some sort of a need for this voice, this voice being my voice, and I I don't want to make too much of that. I don't want to get too big-headed about it. But a lot of people are talking about Zen practice, but nobody's quite saying it the way I'm saying it. And this goes for any competent Zen teacher. You know, everybody has their own way of saying it, and every different way of saying it is vital to make the whole. So I just travel around where people are inviting me, and I sit up in front of them and I answer their questions, and I say things and I tell jokes, and you know, sometimes if someone hands me a guitar, I'll play it.
What you said just reminded me again something that I wrote down was, it's from one of your books, last thing Buddha said before he died was, be lamps unto yourselves.
Yeah.
Which you interpreted as question authority and be yourself.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's an important thing, because that's, you know, there's some controversy over that statement, because it's well understood within the record of Buddha's talks that his final instructions to his students were, be a lamp unto yourselves. Yeah. And yet the Buddhist order continued with a new leader, a guy named Mahakashapa, you know, after Buddha had died. So there's a sense of a kind of a continuing practice and a continuing sort of, I don't want to say authority, but a sense of a centrality to it, of a teacher. But also the crucial thing is to come into yourself. You know, and this thing about question authority, when Wisdom Publications published the book, they took that, and it was in the book, but they made it kind of a big thing about the book. And and now I'm saddled with this question, you know, Brad Warner, question authority, you know, kind of thing. And I've started to think, well, question authority is very important, but it's also important not to just simply blindly gainsay authority. You know, there is a sense of I'm now kind of familiar with of people just doing their jobs, you know, and part of a person's job is to be the authority figure, you know, and you don't want to just rebel against that for the simple sake of rebelling. Yet you always have to be ultimately your own authority. Whether you submit to outside authority or not, you're ultimately your own authority, because you have the choice of submitting to outside authority. You know, so even if you're the most submissive person in the world, you've in some sense are obeying your own authority of authorizing yourself to be submissive.
Yeah, I understand.
You know,
yeah.
So if that's going to be the case, then you might as well just own up to it and say, I'm always going to be my own authority,
yeah.
and proceed from that.
One thing I wanted to talk to you about before you finish was. Before we finish, was that you did a talk at San Quentin prison at one point.
Yeah.
Tell us about that.
Ago. That was interesting. That was at the invitation of my friend Greg Fain, who works at who is a monk at the San Francisco Zen Center. So San Quentin is quite close to San Francisco. And they do a regular thing where they go and lead Zen meditation in San Quentin prison with these high security prisoners, most of whom are life-term people who are never going to get out. You know, some of them may be eligible, but most of them are not. And they're in there because you don't ask. You know, it's not proper to ask. It may be dangerous to ask. But you know going in there that these people you're talking to are there because they mostly committed murder. You know, and probably under very, you know, not just manslaughter or accidental killing somebody. I mean, they actually deliberately took another person's life. So they're very hard people, but they've been in prison for a while, and they are trying to come to terms with what they've done, and that's why they're there for the practice. So it was kind of funny to me to be told that my books were extremely popular at San Quentin.
I'm not at all surprised, actually. Yeah.
So I'm like, oh, that's my audience, you know, hardcore criminals. All right, good. But they were very sincere people, you know, and they come to you and they look so ordinary. You know, most of them, Greg had said this to me when he was telling me what to expect. He said, most of these people are middle-aged men who did something really stupid when they were very young, you know, and so they've they're not the same people anymore who committed whatever act got them into the prison, but at the same time they did it, and so they have to serve time for it. It's a really interesting experience because like one guy told me he had committed himself to Zen practice, and he was in a cell, and you don't get a private cell, you know, he's in a cell with a cellmate or two, I don't know how many, and he was just doing this practice, and their bars, you know, even the floor is open to you know, so they can scrutinize you from every angle. And he said at first the other prisoners were taunting him, sometimes throwing things at him, you know, what are you doing over there, you know, and yelling obscenities and stuff. But he persisted. And after a while, they started to respect him. First, the taunting stopped, and then people started coming up to him saying, well, what is this thing you're doing, and can you show me how to do that? And I thought, well, if you can do Zen practice under those conditions, you know, I have to respect that. You know, much more difficult than anything I've had to face.
Yeah, I remember watching this film a couple of years ago called the Dharma Brothers.
I've heard of it, I haven't seen it.
Yeah, which is very similar. It was a very moving, very touching film, quite a long film, 2 hours. And it was about Zen teachers going into prison in America, I think it's when it was, and they took a group of something like 20 prisoners, put them in a gymnasium for a week, and there was obviously prison officers there as well.
Yeah.
And they had a week or 10 days Zen practice. And they weren't allowed to talk at all during this practice. They just practiced Zen. And then, I forget what it was, a year or 2 years later, they went back, because the guys were all still there, and filmed them again. It was amazing what impact that had on them. And it was amazing the way the prisoners were changing. And I think what you said is very true. They'd done something incredibly stupid and violent and awful years ago, and they weren't essentially the same person, because they'd found a depth in themselves that they weren't in touch with when they did the crime.
And it's amazing what, you know, how that can happen. When I was there, I kept thinking of, you know, the word penitentiary comes from the idea, this sort of Christian idea, that you would be placed in a cell or something in order to repent, you know, to do penitence for the thing you've done. And that was the original intention of a prison. And now we're kind of going back to that, you know, because it had been lost, you know. It wasn't, I don't think, originally intended as a place of necessarily punishment. It was a place where you were supposed to go and sort of reflect on your crimes. And if you've got that, you know, if you're trying to sit still, you know, I was talking about things that churn up in your mind. You know, if you've got a murder that's going to start churning up in your mind while you're practicing, well, that's some pretty hard stuff to deal with. Yeah.
Brad, we're going to have to finish in about a minute.
Okay.
But I wanted to read one more thing which I pulled out of the book, and it's, I don't know if you wrote this or whether someone else did, but I just thought it was a nice way to end. Zen is complete absence of belief. Zen is complete lack of authority. Zen tears away every false refuge you have.
Yeah, I feel that's true, and that in itself, it can be, on the one hand, incredibly liberating, and that's the aspect of it that most people talk about, which is fine. The other aspect is it can be terrifying, you know, because you don't have anything to stand on but your own, you know, your own personal center. So. But once you've gotten rid of the false refuges that you've been chasing around for years and years, it frees you to look for the place where the real peace of mind exists, and to realize that you're carrying it with you at all times. It's incredible.
Brad, thanks very much for coming in, sharing us your story and your wisdom. And I'm just going to show you, I won't read the full titles, but the books again are Hardcore Zen, the first one, which is, they're all readable. This is probably the most readable. Sit Down and Shut Up. And still have to check to hit this. Zen Wrapped in Karma, Dipped in Chocolate. And Zen is touring around, and he has some other books out as well. Thanks again for coming to Conscious TV. And thank you indeed for watching Conscious TV, and I really hope we see you again soon. Goodbye.
Hi, I'm Brad Warner, and you're watching Conscious TV. And I'm going to give you a little demonstration of how to do Zazen practice. It's really quite simple, and you can do it pretty much anywhere. The only prop you need is some sort of a cushion. I just have sort of a couch cushion that I've mashed up so that it's about this big. You just have something to lift your butt up a little bit higher than your knees. And the sitting position, the sort of formal sitting position, is usually the full lotus. There's no necessity to do the full lotus. The full lotus happens to be very convenient if you can do it because it provides you an extremely nice sort of balance. But you don't have to do that. You can do what's called the half lotus position, or you can just kind of put your knees on the floor. The object of the game is to just get your hips up a little bit higher than your knees. The hands go about like so, and I always find it much easier to just show it than to try to explain it. But you're making a circle with your thumb and your fingers here, and it's at about the level of your navel. The more crucial aspect of the practice is to keep your spine straight. So you're trying to find a spot where your spine is kind of balanced on top of your hips, where you're not using a lot of muscular effort to hold up your body, where you're just allowing it to be. But you're finding that spot, like it's like balancing a pencil on your hand or something. You're trying to find that balance spot. And you'll find it and you'll lose it over and over again. I still do after 28 years or something of doing this. Your shoulders should be down. Your chin is slightly kind of tucked in. Your eyes are open. A lot of people, a lot of different forms of meditation are done with closed eyes. In Zen, we have the idea that the inner world and the outer world are both equally important. So we don't want to close our eyes to shut out the outer world. But at the same time, we're trying to look at something neutral. So normally you're doing your Zazen practice facing a wall, preferably a nice blank white or brown wall. If you don't have that, sometimes you can kind of make it. Or you can just kind of avert your eyes sort of downwards, so you're basically looking at the carpet or the floor. And you take this seated position. Some people will like to do a little bit of this, which helps you kind of find the balanced center. And it's kind of a habit that I've picked up, also not necessarily necessary to the practice, of just kind of taking 3 deep breaths when I begin. So I'm just letting them out. And once you've kind of begun the practice, you set yourself a period of time to do it, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, sometimes 40 minutes. And just sit there. If thoughts start to bubble up into your head, as much as possible, try to just let them pass. If you don't give a lot of energy and attention to your thoughts, they'll go away on their own, which is something a lot of us have trouble with because we tend to think we are our thoughts. But that's not really true. Thoughts are just something that goes on. It's something your brain does. It's an important function of your brain, obviously, but it's something you don't need to pay attention to. So you just stop paying attention to your thoughts as much as possible. If you find yourself paying attention to your thoughts, my teacher told me this years ago, and I didn't believe him when he said it, but I've never found it to be untrue. If you find yourself lost in thought, your posture will also be wrong. I'm exaggerating a bit, but your posture will become off. So when you find yourself lost in a thought and you notice that, just bring your posture back and start sitting again. And really, that's all there is to the practice. It's extraordinarily simple, yet mountains of literature have been devoted to what people have discovered through this ridiculously simple practice. And it's really all we do. Once you finish, once your allotted time, even if you decide to do 5 minutes, has finished, just get up and go about your business, have your normal day. And that's it. I do it personally every morning and almost every evening. And these days, it makes me feel like I'm ready to begin my day. It's like brushing my teeth or something. I don't want to go out without doing it. So that's about it. That's my little moment of Zen for you. So try it out for yourself and see if it helps. See if it makes you feel better. Thanks.